Don't worry. Strata players, hi. I have not forgotten about you. I got burned out, I took an extended break, but now I'm back, and there is a massive update in the pipeline. More about that later in the video. But in an effort to both get back into the swing of things and stretch my creative muscles, I've been making a lot of microgames recently. These are tiny 10-second games, each one based around a unique, interesting, and wacky idea that the player is expected to get accustomed to and either win or lose in the space of about 10 seconds. The workflow for making one of these games is kind of like a science experiment. I'll have an idea, test it out, and if it's fun, I'll refine it and develop it into a finished game. And it was during one of these sessions that I realized I'd struck gold. I started the day with the goal of converting my 2D side-scroller template into a more general movement script that could handle both 2D platforming and top-down movement. This was pretty simple. Instead of just taking a float to represent the horizontal input, I take in a vector 2 to represent all input and then pass that into a rigid body. Looking at this system in isolation, I realized that the only thing really separating it from being a top-down controller versus a side-scroller controller is whether gravity was enabled. If I disable vertical movement, add a jump and turn on gravity, then I've got a 2D platformer. Allowing both movement directions and disabling gravity gives me something more like a top-down bullet hell. And finally, allowing both movement directions and enabling gravity gives me this. A helicopter. So far, so standard. Chances are you've played at least one game that has pretty much this exact same control scheme. But recently, I've been spending a lot of time experimenting with how physics interactions can add interesting wrinkles to otherwise simple gameplay. This is because these microgames I've been making are part of a larger commission. We're on quite a tight time budget, so that's led to design constraints that have pushed me to experiment in different ways. Thanks to a certain very good Netflix show, the concept of three-body problems is very much in the public consciousness right now. So I'm going to exploit that positive association, along with your anticipation to see the actual wacky game that I've made, to infodump about physics. Now, most game designers have experimented quite a lot with randomness. It's a really great tool, and you can develop some very interesting pieces of gameplay using randomness as a mechanic. Now, I like randomness as much as the next guy, but what I love is its renegade cousin, chaos. There are a lot of very good explanations of chaos out there, but while researching this video, I came across a quote that just sums it up perfectly. Chaos is... ladder. No, chaos is when the present determines the future, but the approximate present does not approximately determine the future. So the same Minecraft seed will always produce exactly the same world, but change just one character and you get something completely different. Chaos normally happens when the output of an interaction is fed back into the system as an input. So if we look at the double pendulum experiment, we can see that the first pendulum's velocity affects that of the second pendulum, which then goes back and affects the first pendulum's velocity on the next frame. Or in the case of the actual three-body problem, see, this wasn't a total tangent, every object in the system affects every other object in the system through gravity. So even a slight change in the position of one planet will have massive knock-on effects down the line once you consider the interaction between the two others. So why is this such an incredible game design tool? Well, put simply, humans are approximate creatures. Unless you're a Mario speedrunner, you don't do everything frame perfectly every single time. So simply by adding a second physics body to the simulation that affects the main player physics body and vice versa, we get a system that's both entirely player-driven while also being impossible to predict. Now, Unity has a bunch of features that let you add quite complex physics behaviors without writing any code, which was perfect for my tight time constraints. The first project I made with this idea in mind was you would control a little rocket ship around an asteroid field. The catch is that every object in the game has a point effector which simulates gravity. So not only do these asteroids attract each other, but they also attract the player. This leads to situations where you're trying to slingshot your way around an asteroid while maintaining enough speed to not get sucked too deep into their sphere of influence. So how did I apply these concepts to transform this very, very simple helicopter controller into a system that I felt was worth spending 2 days developing into a full game. The first thing I added was a wrecking ball. This thing has way more mass than the player controller itself, but your helicopter has enough force to lift both itself and this mass. This created a system where the momentum of the wrecking ball has more authority over your movement than you do. So your overall change in velocity on any given frame is a combination of your movement input and the swing of the ball. And since both of these bodies influence each other, we have a chaotic system. This alone is really fun to control. It feels super unintuitive at first, but when you master it, you can move with a lot of speed and a lot of precision. If you're a dev, I'd encourage you to try creating this system yourself. I'd be really interested to see what different creations people make using this as a jumping off point. But now for the big question. What did I make with it? Recently, I've been watching an awful lot of a Trackmania event called Deep Dip 2. If you have no idea what I just said, then you're probably in the majority. Basically, it's a riff on Bennett Foddy's Getting Over It, but in a racing sim. You probably know where I'm going with this. You've read the title, you're an enlightened gigachad, and also very handsome. But basically, I'm a silly wee guy. And when I was thinking about what would be fun to do as a helicopter with a wrecking ball, I audibly cackled at the thought of golf. This was definitely in part inspired by the recent Jacob Geller video, but to me there's just this beautiful comedy in trying to do a really precise task with really imprecise tools. So while Getting Over It is a meditation on frustration as a gameplay aesthetic, my game is kind of a comedy. The game's difficulty and the rage and frustration that comes with it is really just there to serve that silly goal. But you guys know me. You know everything I make has to be insanely deep at a mechanical level. It's just what I'm geared towards making as a designer. I love gameplay systems that are deceptively simple with extremely high skill ceilings. Patricia Taxon's video on Marble Blast makes a really great point. She points out that the game's depth and speedrunability are just natural byproducts of the game's simple physics engine. And helicopter golf is much the same. My job as the designer is simply to seek those mechanics out, and then create gameplay around teaching and contextualizing them. With this style of design, nothing needs to be explained to the player directly. This lets me get away with an extremely minimalist approach to UI. In fact, the only UI element in the entire game is the title card. The only thing that might need to be communicated is the controls, and I feel like the visuals do a good enough job of that. You see a helicopter on screen and assume you can fly around, so you start wiggling around some controls, the game responds, and your assumption is confirmed. To communicate the goal to the player, I'm using visual affordances. Basically, I'm relying on the player's pre-existing knowledge of the world around them. After the title screen, the camera slowly pans down to the player, revealing the entire course as it goes. One of the first things we see is a flagpole with a hole next to it. Most people will have enough familiarity with golf to assume that's where they're trying to get to. The second thing this camera pan achieves is putting the fear of God in the player. We start very zoomed out, and even though we do get the full scale of the tower, we don't see our player model until the very end. So as the camera zooms in, we're slowly building up anticipation, and then when we finally realize just how tiny we are compared to the massive challenge that's ahead of us, that's when the fear sets in. But we still don't have the full context for just how hard this journey's going to be. For that, we need to hit the ball. The golf ball is both incredibly bouncy and much less massive than the wrecking ball that you're hitting it with. This makes it incredibly sensitive to the factors of the impact when you hit it. Slight variations in the initial speed and angle of the hit will have massive ramifications on where the ball eventually ends up. This makes it incredibly easy to fumble the ball. Some of my favorite moments from this game have come from when I've overconfidently tried to save the ball, only to knock it way further than it would have initially gone had I just left it. On the flip side, when you do finally nail that tricky putt, the feeling is euphoric. In true IO fashion, there is a ton of potential for different skips and routing options. And though I wouldn't recommend it, I am very curious to see if any die-hard speedrunners want to give this one a go. But speaking of speedrunning, as you can see, I'm still very deep in development on Strata. And while I will be releasing some new content for everybody soon, TM, the current work in progress is up right now on my Patreon. As well as generally being a lot more polished, this update also includes 2 beefy new levels. I've slowly been refining my craft as a level designer, and to me these levels feel much deeper and a lot more interesting to play through. That's also where you can get your hands on Helicopter Golf. But if you'd like to see the game on Steam, let me know. Putting a game on Steam takes both time and money, but depending on how well the game does, that might end up being a worthwhile investment. I think Helicopter Golf is a very streamable game, so I will definitely be sending out some copies to content creators. As always, if you fed the YouTube algorithm by interacting with this video in any way, thank you very much. Also, a long overdue thank you to everyone who's supported the project financially so far. Those include people who donated to Strata on Itch. If you are one of those people, check your email, there's a gift for you in there. And also, my 3 patrons. Thank you so much, you guys. You've helped me buy groceries. Okay, I just rambled unscripted about a jam game for 12 minutes. Bye!